Hi, this is Mrs. Politsky, and I've got notes for Chapter 8, specifically Section 1. And we're going to talk a little bit about the sectional conflict intensifying that is leading to the beginnings of the American Civil War. So you're going to need your Chapter 8, Section 1 guided note, and we're going to get started here. And as we are going through notes, you may want to listen carefully. There may be some additional things that I say that might not necessarily be lined up with the numbers and the blanks that you're going to be filling in, but might be something that's going to come back to haunt you. So we're going to talk about the Wilmot Proviso. And the Wilmot Proviso has everything to do with the ending of the Mexican War. The Mexican War was fought in the 1840s, and there was a lot of questions that came up about this new territory that the United States was able to obtain from Mexico, and part of that was what do you do with it in terms of slavery? And so some of our members of Congress at the time were talking about that, and one of the documents that came out of this was something known as the Wilmot Proviso. And this proposed that slavery would not exist in any territory the United States gained from Mexico. Sounds great. But we've got some other issues on the book already. We had in 1820 issued something called the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise, for the most part, basically said for every slave state that entered the Union, a free state would have to come in. And it had a lot to do with the admission of the state of Missouri and the admission of the state of Maine. And in a sense, this allows for a balance between free and slave. But with all this new territory, particularly the fact that a lot of this new territory was, for the most part, centering around the 36-degree and 30-degree latitude, which was kind of drawn up with the Missouri Compromise, saying that anything south of there would be slave and anything north could be free. Some of this land, was right in the heart of that, particularly one that becomes very important in the 1850s, California. Okay, the thing about the Wilmot Proviso is that even though it was proposed, it never became law. Okay. Another idea known as popular sovereignty kind of enters the book. And this whole concept of popular sovereignty, you kind of have to go back and think about constitutional characteristics. You know, our U.S. Constitution was really written on the basis of the idea of popular sovereignty. This idea, the popular meaning the people, and sovereignty meaning free to choose. And so the concept here would be is that the people would be free to choose whether or not to be slave or to have no slavery. So in number 2, the idea known as popular sovereignty suggested that citizens of each new territory should be allowed to decide if it wanted to permit slavery. It sounds like a great idea. As a matter of fact, that's going to come back to haunt us when we get to about 1854. Henry Clay, who we saw on this previous slide, yep, that's Henry Clay right there, senator from Kentucky, tried to find a compromise that would allow for the state of California to join the Union as a free state. And what we're going to find is that we're going to have some more legislation. We're eventually going to hear a little bit about something called the Compromise of 1850. So, taking a look at our map here, if we were looking at, what was slave and what was not, kind of leading into the time period that we're talking about, if I would draw a line here, kind of basically forming the northern borders of North Carolina and Kentucky, and probably what would be Arkansas and to a little bit of Oklahoma, we would basically say that a lot of the states that are south of there would basically be slave states. Okay, we have a few border states, particularly Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri, And Missouri, we heard a little bit about with that Missouri Compromise. Maine would be added to the Union, Missouri would be added to the Union, and they would, for the most part, balance this all out. But Kentucky and Virginia, you know, we had people that had already settled here well before the 1820s, and some of them had brought their slaves. And just so we're clear, truth is, you could pretty much go in any of the states in the North if you were in the 1820s, and you probably would find slaves that had traveled there with their owners. And so this is going to bring up some questions about whether or not a state that did not necessarily allow slavery, wouldn't those enslaved people be basically free? And eventually that's going to have to go all the way to the Supreme Court to determine whether or not that would be allowed. Number 7, John C. Calhoun, that you see here, who happened to be a member of Congress, from South Carolina, of course, predicted that if the South could not live safe or in the safety within the Union, that the only solution would be secession. This whole idea that a state would choose to leave the Union of the United States. It's kind of interesting because at the time that he was making these predictions, he was a man who was aged. He was getting up there. As a matter of fact, he was in very poor health. He was literally on his deathbed. And yet, it's almost like a prophecy. What he's saying is, you know, this is a possibility that could happen in the future. Number 8, the Fugitive Slave Act. Basically had been conceived as a benefit to slaveholders, but it actually hurt the Southern cause by increasing Northern hostility towards slavery. This whole idea that regular citizens could be forced to be involved in helping to round up individuals who had fled slaveholders and be forced to, in a way, police this act, even though they may find it to be totally offensive to their beliefs. And number 10, the Fugitive Slave Act's requirement that ordinary citizens help capture runaways drove many into active defiance. If you take a look at our photo here, you know, we have an individual who probably has been at some point in time a fugitive slave, and as a way to punish them, they have put this device around their neck, which, by the way, these were not uncommon. In a way, it's to show that this is a person who is a flight risk, that they have at some point in time tried to run away from their master. And by having this on them, and maybe even having other things, you look down here at the feet, it looks like his feet have been perhaps maybe chained together. This might make it difficult for a person to move freely. And if they were having to, you know, kind of hide in the undergrowth of trees and the woods, it might be very difficult for them to survive in that kind of condition. Number 11, the Underground Railroad was an informal but well-organized system that began in the 1830s that helped thousands of enslaved persons escape. After running as a serial in an anti-slavery newspaper, Uncle Tom's Cabin came out in book form in 1852 and sold 300,000 copies in its first year. In 1853, Senator Stephen A. Douglas from the state of Illinois prepared a bill to organize the territory west of Missouri and Iowa into a new territory called Nebraska. Some of this was under the motivation that if he did this, he might be able to profit from it, because this was a period of time when there were many people talking about the possibility of building a transcontinental railroad. And you know how things go in Washington, there were some people that were stakeholders, and Douglas himself may have profited by having a railroad that would start as a terminus maybe in Chicago and go all the way to California, traveling right through the state of Nebraska. At the same time, there had been people maybe prior to this time who had been demanding maybe a transcontinental railroad going through a southern route. And that again was a source of concern because of the issues of slavery. All right. So we mentioned that there were some people that had acted in defiance, and we get into the 1850s, particularly about 1854 into 1855, after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And in the state of Kansas, there were many of these border ruffians that had moved from the state of Missouri. Many of these folks with slaves, particularly one individual, a man named Atchison, who became a very vocal individual about perhaps moving some of his followers into the state of Kansas to help make Kansas a slave state. For the most part, a guy named John Brown, who had been an abolitionist from back east, brought some of his family to Kansas. And what we're going to end up having is an event known as Bleeding Kansas. And the truth be it, what happened in Kansas was really kind of like the pre-American Civil War, because it was a real bloodshed in that area. A lot of the violence focused in an area basically between Lawrence, Kansas, and if you're not really sure where Lawrence is really due west of the Kansas City metropolitan area, and not very far, okay, probably within 30 minutes of that if you were driving it today, and around the city of Topeka. And there's not a long distance between Topeka and Lawrence. It's, a matter of probably 25 miles or so. And eventually we're going to have a series of battles that are going to happen within this area. And there is, individuals who obviously are killed in this situation. And it's kind of like the writing on the wall. It's, what we're seeing happen in Kansas is kind of like a microcosm of what's going to happen in states like Virginia in the next decade. Thank you very much.